So start of a series of videos where I'm going to go through each section, go through a little bit of theory to complement what we do in class, and then give you some questions. This will tie in with the yellow booklet of all the different questions that we've tried to predict. So here we go into section 1. So if we look at section 1, the first thing I would point out is the fact that it's August. And that could give us significant cash flow problems. Now, cash flow is obviously an issue between money coming in and money leaving the business. And because this is seasonal, clearly they're only going to have 1 3-day period where they bring in a lot of revenue. Now, it does say that they sell T-shirts for a couple of months before and a month afterwards. But largely speaking, this might suffer from cash flow problems. So you might bring in the fact that an overdraft could potentially be needed during those winter months of planning when they're still paying for things, hiring of various equipment, etc. So that's a source of finance in itself. The next thing I'd like to point out is the fact that it's a limited company. And for that reason, that brings us into, if it's limited, it opens up the option of shares. Now, because it's limited, they're only effectively selling to friends and family, or at least people that have agreed to sell to. So ownership isn't diluted to the same extent as a PLC would be, where they sell to anybody and anyone on the stock exchange who's got the money to do so. However, they could expand further and become that PLC, and that then opens up the release of even more shares if they want to expand. And we might look later on at the fact that the grant that they get, well, that could potentially disappear as councils' budgets shrink as the government uses the austerity budget to cut costs. So it's a 3-day festival, which has implications for revenue. So you've got only a chance to create revenue over those 3 days, other than, like we said, the T-shirt sales. And then that has a bearing on, the fact it's 3 days has a bearing on the number of people that can turn up. So we know that 10,000 people attended this festival last year. If you're going to work out how much revenue the festival has created, then you need to know how many people have turned up and the average selling price. Now, we know how many people turned up in last year, and we know how much the 3-day pass is this year, but obviously we don't know we don't know both figures for both last year and this year. So at the moment we can't actually work out a revenue figure. We'd also need to add T-shirt sales and any other merchandise to that as well. This can be linked with this 3 days with the fact that, you know, we get income from the EU because 20% of the customers are from the EU. Is that going to be the same? Might even be able to bring in Brexit, because that might have an impact on the relationship really with Europe and the UK, whether people are going to come across. We don't know really whether trade stalls are coming over from Europe or whether it's all from mainland England, but it's certainly a consideration when you're talking about revenue that a large chunk comes from overseas. Now, it says later on about the exchange rate, which we'll go into in greater depth later on. We've then got this drunk and badly behaved element, and this is where I'd like you to be able to talk about stakeholders. Quite often when this comes up, there is a question about conflict. So the conflict here is between the customer, the drunk customer, and the local residents. So you've then probably got in the middle of that, to resolve that, you've got police. Now, police come at a cost. So in this particular stakeholder conflict, you've got another cost implication, because it would obviously need policing to restore good behaviour. So when we've looked at that stakeholder conflict, make sure you're using these quotes. We could then move on to the EU and the exchange rate. So I've already talked a little bit about the 20%. And what I'd like you to bring in is the classic spiced. So be able to, even if you forget about what it means, just be able to talk about how a strong pound, imports are cheap, exports are dear. Now what that means is if it's a strong pound, just think of the pound as a person. So if it's strong, this person has muscles and can pick up more things. Right? If it's a really weak person, it can not pick up as much. So that's a weak pound. So strong pound, weak pound. So here you class that as one person or £1, and it can pick up 3 things. Or in this case, let's say €3, although that's certainly not the exchange rate. In this weak pound case, you deal with that's one person again, that weak person, and it can pick up €2. So if this is the case, and we've got a strong pound, this situation here is not good for customers from EU. Because for every €3 they give, they exchange into pounds, they only get 1 back. So they're going to have to spend a lot of their euros to get not many pounds. Whereas this situation here is good for the EU traveller because it only needs to swap 2 of its euros to get 1 English pound back. And therefore, if that's the case, if it's a weak pound, you would get more than 20%. If you get a strong pound, you're probably going to see the 20% drop. So that's the thing you need to remember. We've got here the 60% are 30 years old. That's where you need to be able to talk about your target audience. Now, your target audience are the people you are aiming at. So they like a certain thing. They often have a certain amount of disposable income. Pre-30, there'll still be a large percentage of people who don't have a family. Therefore, they've got more disposable income because they have to spend on kids, etc. And also, 70% of your target audience have high incomes compared to a year average. So you've got basically people with money to spend. Now that, later on, is something that you can contrast with the Bowton area, because we find out later on, so that's a contrast that would get you loads of marks if you talk about one piece of information compared to another. If you contrast it with Bowton, where there is lower than average wages and also high unemployment. So the people going to the festival are different to the local residents, and that in itself is something to bear in mind when you're setting up a festival, because you effectively want both. You want the local residents and you want people from further afield. There is a clear discussion all the way through this paper about business ethics. Now, business ethics are, I suppose, in vogue quite a lot recently. A business that does things correctly. It has an eye on the environment. It has an eye on the carbon footprint it creates. It's very keen on green initiatives and recycling. In this case, protecting the environment and its people. Now, this in itself, this ethical stance, it's good for the environment, but it's very good for public relations. It's very good to PR, to sell the festival itself. People are prepared to pay a higher price when things are green, and you would also be able to, and this links with something later on, secure that grant if the festival is ethical. Because the council will probably say, yes, we'll give you that 30 grand if you prove to us that you can put a sustainable festival together. And the last thing in this section is the level of competition. The only retailer of outdoor pursuits gear in the town. So if the competition is low, then it basically means you can charge more for your prices. So they're in a position where they've probably been charging quite a bit, although not massively, because we remember the local residents don't have much disposable income. However, this again can be contrasted with what might happen at the festival when there are far more competitors. I think it goes up to 22 retailers. If that's the case, then they will probably have to bring prices down to compete with national chains. Now, that's a real challenge for these small businesses because they don't have the economies of scale to offer cheaper prices because their unit cost is higher. So again, you've got two things. You're comparing something from here and something from later. That's all the bits I want to pick up from section 1. Questions that I would like you to have a think about. So when I've read them out, then pause and have a go at them. So I'd like you to think about this question 1, what evidence is there to suggest that there may have been conflict between stakeholders at last year's festival? So I've talked about that, and you put it into fully formed paragraphs. So pause it and have a go. Question 2. If the pound becomes weaker against the euro, how might this affect visitor numbers from the Eurozone? Again, I've spoken about it. Pause it, have a go in full response rather than my notes that I've scribbled. And last one, question 3. Why might Spirit of Adventure have to alter its prices if it has a stand at Bowton Mountain Festival Limited? And I've just spoken about. So they're the 3 key questions I'd like to respond off the back of section 1. Thank you. I'll hopefully be putting together section 2 video very shortly, and you can have a look at that as well. Cheers.